It was one of the most complex, audacious military operations in decades.
At 2:41 a.m., the lights went out on a hillside overlooking Caracas. Not because of a blackout, because someone pulled the switch. Security cameras froze mid-frame. Motion sensors went dark. And inside a walled compound officially listed as abandoned government property, doors began opening that had not been unlocked in years. This was not a Venezuelan police action. This was a joint FBI-DEA operation, authorized under sealed emergency directives, targeting a location U.S. intelligence had quietly labeled Site Echo. On paper, the mansion didn't exist. No address, no utilities, no registered occupants. But for 14 months, satellites kept returning to it. Same pattern, same anomaly. Food deliveries, twice a week, always after midnight. Enough meals for dozens of people. No staff, no guests, no official residents. The numbers never added up, until they did. At 2:43 a.m., breaching teams moved in from three sides. The outer wall collapsed inward under shaped charges designed to avoid noise. Agents flooded the east wing first, weapons down, cameras rolling, every step timed to the second. Inside, the rooms were immaculate. Marble floors, imported furniture, art that never appeared in any public Maduro residence. But then they reached the interior hallway. The doors were different, steel reinforced, no handles on the inside, locks mounted on the outside only. The first door took 12 seconds to breach. Behind it was a woman sitting on the floor, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket that didn't belong to her. She flinched when the door opened, shielding her face as if expecting punishment. She kept repeating the same sentence in Spanish over and over. They told us no one was coming. At 2:51 a.m., agents opened the second door, then the third, then the fourth. Each room the same. Mattresses on the floor. No windows, no phones, no clocks. Some women cried. Some didn't react at all. A few stared at the doorway like they didn't trust what they were seeing. By the time the lower level was cleared, agents knew this was no guest house. This was containment. At 3:09 a.m., a stairwell hidden behind a false wall was discovered. It led underground into a corridor not shown on any blueprint recovered from Venezuelan records. That corridor changed everything. More rooms, more locked doors, women from different countries, different accents, different languages. Some had entered Venezuela legally and vanished from immigration logs days later. Others had no travel records at all. When medical teams finished their sweep, the count was finalized. 32 women, alive, removed from a property officially listed as vacant. But the most dangerous discovery came after the rescue. In a secure office beneath the main residence, protected by a biometric lock tied to Venezuelan military credentials, agents found a ledger on a metal desk. Names, dates, transfer notes, and next to several entries, a single word written in red ink: entregado, delivered. If you think this raid was just about a mansion, or just about abuse, or just about secrecy, you're missing what came next. Because the ledger didn't end in Caracas. It pointed outward. The ledger was thin, no more than 30 pages, but every line carried weight. Names written in careful block letters, dates that matched satellite activity, and besides several entries, destination codes that didn't match any airport, port, or military base inside Venezuela. They matched private airstrips. At 3:27 a.m., while the last women were being escorted out under blankets and tactical cover, a DEA analyst on site began cross-referencing the codes against U.S. trafficking databases. Within minutes, his voice dropped. 3 of the destinations weren't in South America at all. They were linked to offshore transit hubs in the Caribbean, places known not for tourism but for what moved through after midnight under diplomatic clearance. That's when Federal Command realized this wasn't an isolated holding site, it was a staging node. At 3:41 a.m., an emergency transmission went out over a secure channel. All outbound flights from 3 regional airfields were flagged. Venezuelan air traffic control was quietly overridden through a pre-negotiated contingency agreement that had never been acknowledged publicly. Planes already on the runway were told to stand down. Pilots didn't argue. They never do when the order comes that way. Inside the mansion, agents continued their sweep. Behind a second biometric door, they found encrypted laptops, burner phones, and a wall-mounted screen displaying a rotating schedule. Names appeared, disappeared, and reappeared with timestamps beside them. Some timestamps were in the future. One was less than 12 hours away. Had the raid been delayed even a single day, several of the women rescued that night would not have been there to be found. They would have been delivered. At 4:02 a.m., a call came in from Washington. Not a congratulation, not relief, a warning. The operation had tripped alarms far beyond Caracas. Signals intelligence picked up unusual activity inside Venezuelan military communications. Orders were being issued, then abruptly canceled. Units were told to mobilize, then told to stand down. Someone was trying to figure out who had authorized the breach, and more importantly, who else knew? Because the mansion was not owned by the state on paper. It was held through a chain of shell entities, cultural foundations, and security contracts routed through third countries. Legally deniable, politically insulated. The women were moved first. By 4:18 a.m., all 32 had been extracted, sedated where necessary, loaded into unmarked transport vehicles, and transferred to a temporary secure facility under foreign protection. No press, no statements, no flags. Several of them had never spoken to law enforcement before. Some didn't even know which country they were in when the doors opened. One woman asked a medic a single question as she was guided into the vehicle. "Are they gone forever?" The medic didn't answer. He couldn't. Back inside the compound, agents turned their attention to the final room. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. The room was empty except for a long table, 6 chairs, and a wall covered in framed photographs. Politicians, military officials, business leaders, all taken at formal events. Some of the faces were familiar, some were not. Several photos had small marks in the corner, not visible at first glance, tiny symbols etched into the glass. The same symbols appeared in the ledger. That was the moment the scope became unavoidable. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a meeting place. At 5:11 a.m., as dawn approached Caracas, Federal Command issued the final instruction. No arrests, no announcements, no attribution. The mansion was to be sealed, sanitized, and returned to its vacant status before daylight. By the time the sun rose over the hillside, the gates were closed again. Power restored, cameras back online. To anyone driving past, nothing had happened, but 32 women were no longer where they were supposed to be. And somewhere, someone was waking up to a ledger that no longer sat where it should. By mid-morning, the ledger had already changed hands 3 times. From Caracas, it moved to a secure analysis unit outside the country, then to a joint task force cell, where no single agency had full visibility, and finally, to a compartmented group that existed only on paper, activated for operations that were never meant to surface. The destination codes were decoded first. They weren't airports by name. They were windows, time-based clearances tied to diplomatic flight corridors, private jets registered to shell leasing companies, aircraft that never showed up on public flight trackers because they didn't need to. One code mapped to a strip in the Eastern Caribbean, used by humanitarian flights. Another aligned with a private terminal in Southern Europe reserved for government delegations. A third pointed to an airfield in the Middle East that processed passengers under special exemption protocols. This was not trafficking, as people understood it. It was logistics. When analysts overlaid the ledger dates with known diplomatic movements, the pattern tightened. Certain names disappeared from the mansion records days before high-level visits. Others appeared shortly after international summits, cultural exchanges, or closed-door bilateral meetings. The women weren't random. They were selected. At 11:06 a.m., a secondary file hidden inside one of the seized laptops was decrypted. It was mislabeled as inventory maintenance, buried beneath layers of mundane spreadsheets. Inside were psychological profiles, age, language, education, compliance scores, notes written in clinical shorthand, isolated, adaptable, low resistance, high value presentation. No prices were listed because this wasn't a marketplace. It was a supply chain. That's when the task force made the call no one wanted to make out loud. The mansion was not the end of the line. It was a filter. At 1:14 p.m., intelligence units flagged unusual movements connected to several individuals whose photographs had been found on the mansion wall. Not arrests, not escapes. Preemptive silence. Phones powered off, accounts drained, travel plans quietly canceled. A few diplomatic aides failed to appear for scheduled events. One foreign delegation abruptly cut short a visit with no explanation. The ripple was spreading. At 3:37 p.m., a message came in from a partner service overseas. One of the destination windows had gone dark. A private terminal had shut down its diplomatic lounge without notice. Staff were told to leave early. Records were sealed. Someone had realized the pipeline was compromised. By nightfall, the 32 women were separated into small groups and relocated again. Not together, not permanently. They were being protected, but they were also being preserved as witnesses. Some spoke immediately, others didn't speak at all. One described being told she had been chosen for service. Another said she was promised work, then moved between houses until her phone disappeared and the doors stopped opening from the inside. Several described the same detail without ever meeting each other. They were told the same thing. You are safe because you are valuable. That phrase appeared nowhere in the documents, which meant it came from people. By the second day, the pressure reached Washington, not public pressure, private. Questions from offices that didn't usually ask questions. Concerns raised about jurisdiction, optics, stability. Quiet suggestions that certain threads did not need to be pulled any further. The response from the task force was short. The ledger had already been copied. Too many hands had seen it. You don't put something like that back into the dark, but what could be done was slow it. Fragments of the investigation were compartmentalized. Some leads went cold by design. Others were handed to foreign partners who could move without headlines. The mansion in Caracas remained sealed, officially empty, officially irrelevant. But inside intelligence circles, it became a reference point, not for what happened there, for what it revealed, that a system existed, that it operated across borders, that it hid behind legitimacy, diplomacy, and silence, and that it assumed no one would ever open the doors. 32 women disrupted that assumption. They were never supposed to be found together, never supposed to be counted, never supposed to be removed alive. The operation didn't collapse the network, it exposed it. And once a structure like that is seen, it doesn't disappear, it adapts. In the weeks that followed, the mansion was scrubbed down to the concrete, furniture removed, walls repainted, hard drives pulverized. The underground corridor was sealed with reinforced concrete and officially classified as a structural defect repaired after a water intrusion. No photos were released, no footage leaked, no statements issued. On paper, nothing had ever happened there. But inside secure systems, the address was quietly flagged with a designation reserved for places that were never to be used again. Burned. The women were never returned to Caracas. Each one was processed under a different identity protocol. Some were relocated to countries they had never planned to visit. Others were reunited with families who had believed they were lost years earlier. A few chose complete disappearance, new names, new lives. No paper trail linking them back to that hillside. They were given a choice. Testify or vanish. Several chose both. Behind closed doors, fragments of their testimony were recorded, not in courtrooms, not under oath, in secure rooms with no windows, where questions were asked carefully and answers were never written down in full. Patterns emerged. The mansion was described the same way by women who had never met. The schedule, the rules, the rotations, the visits that happened late at night and ended before dawn. The sense that the people in charge were never afraid, because they believed they were untouchable. One woman described hearing helicopters overhead and being told to stay silent because important people were nearby. Another recalled seeing military uniforms pass through rooms where no soldiers were supposed to be. Several mentioned the same detail, unprompted. They were never beaten, they were managed. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. As the investigation slowed, something else began to happen. Certain international initiatives were quietly canceled. Cultural exchanges delayed. Diplomatic travel rerouted. Funding streams once taken for granted became tangled in compliance reviews that went nowhere but stopped everything. No explanation was given. But the flow changed. Inside intelligence briefings, the Caracas site was no longer discussed as a crime scene. It was referred to as a prototype, a place that showed how exploitation could be hidden inside respectability, how power could shield abuse without needing secrecy, only silence, how systems built for diplomacy could be repurposed into corridors no one questioned. The ledger never resurfaced. Officially, it was logged, analyzed, and archived. Unofficially, it became something else, a reference. Every time a similar pattern appeared somewhere else, analysts would pull an old file and compare notes. Different country, different names, same structure. Quiet property, unregistered occupants, diplomatic cover, human beings treated as assets. No arrests were ever announced in connection with the mansion. That absence was not accidental, because in cases like this, justice does not arrive with sirens. It arrives as pressure, as closed doors, as careers that stall, as invitations that stop coming, as people who once moved freely suddenly finding every path narrowed. And sometimes, justice arrives as survival. 32 women were not supposed to survive that place. They did. did. And because they did, something powerful learned a lesson it never expected to learn. That even systems designed to be invisible can be disrupted, not by force, but by exposure. And somewhere, long after the gates were resealed and the hillside went quiet again, someone opened a secure folder, saw the reference code for Site Echo, and made a decision they had never planned to make: to dismantle quietly, to move slower, to never assume again that no one was coming, because this time someone did.